being an advocate for human rights. Human rights, from the right to vote to the right to shelter, are fundamental to ensuring dignity, freedom, justice, equality, and peace in our world. They are the rights of all human beings, regardless of who they are, where they were born, how they worship, or who they love. The Advocates was founded on the principle that we all have a part to play in making human rights a reality. This year, we mobilized more than 1,000 volunteers to represent and protect victims of human rights abuses and to change the systems that allow those human rights abuses to occur in the first place. Together with our volunteers, we leveraged our budget almost 7 times to do nearly $15 million in human rights work. One of the greatest privileges of my life was to be a volunteer for the Advocates. At the Advocates, I worked on projects where I knew I could make a contribution, but I didn't realize how doing that work would change me. I didn't just do human rights work, I became an advocate for human rights. I will forever be grateful to the organization for allowing me to volunteer. And now, as executive director, I work to ensure others have similar opportunities to do good in the world. One of the most memorable conversations I ever had was with a client who had just received the news that his asylum was granted after a long process taking several years. When I congratulated him, he looked at me bright-eyed and said, "Last night was the first night I was able to really sleep since the day I arrived. It was a good day." We will hear tonight about some of the powerful results of this work. We will look at lives saved and laws and policies improved to prevent human rights violations. We know that volunteering matters. Thank you to all the wonderful volunteers who have given so much to so many people. Thank you to the donors, activists, and allies for all your hard work. For those of you who've thought about doing human rights work, it's time to get off the sidelines. Now is the time to be an advocate for human rights and start changing the world for good. Thank you.
2020. It's been a year. Around the globe, the COVID-19 pandemic has killed more than 1 million people, disproportionately impacting those on the margins. The virus has left low-wage frontline workers among the most vulnerable. Meanwhile, the right to seek and enjoy asylum in the United States is under attack. Federal executions have resumed. Governments are turning their backs on the human rights of LGBTQ persons and are pushing back against the hard-won rights of women to be free from violence. The extrajudicial killing of George Floyd has led to widespread protests in our home community and around the globe, and laid bare the continuing violence of white supremacy.
One of the reasons I'm a board member is that I want to respond to the question my father always had at the end of any debate that we ever had about politics and social justice issues, and that was, well, what are you going to do about it? What action are you going to take? That's what the Advocates are all about.
It's time to advocate for human rights. Everybody has a part to play in defending human rights.
It is my view that the human rights idea has to become the central organizing principle for the planet.
And I think through the work of Minnesota Advocates, based in Minnesota, yet I think that the dream, the vision, the program can flourish in such a way that it shines a light on the world.
Advocates for Human Rights, you have the floor.
Mr. President, members of the Commission of Inquiry.
The Advocates for Human Rights works to hold governments accountable for human rights violations. Our demand for accountability and an end to impunity is more important today than ever before.
The Advocates for Human Rights has collaborated with human rights organizations on ground, such as my organization, Alternative Cameroon, as well as other NGOs from more than 30 other countries. These collaborations address a wide range of issues, including gender-based violence, pretrial detention, the death penalty and detention condition, discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and racial and ethnic discrimination.
We work with partners in our home community and around the globe to address some of the most intractable human rights issues. From racism in the United States,
Mr. Vice President, the Advocates for Human Rights is deeply concerned about the rise in hate crimes and incidents of bias targeting racial, ethnic, and religious minorities in the United States.
In Minnesota, in particular, where Mr. Floyd was killed, of the handful of officers prosecuted here, only one resulted in a conviction, and that was of a Black Somali American officer who shot a white woman.
To concerted efforts to roll back human rights protections for women.
Canada recommends that Tunisia first repeal Article 227 of the Criminal Code, which allows the perpetrators of rape to escape prosecution if they marry their victims.
The Advocates' unique approach grounds policy work in the lived experiences of our partners and clients. When our clients experience injustice, we advocate to help them find safety and to change the systems that perpetuate those injustices.
Christine fled Burundi, where she was an incredibly successful businesswoman. That sort of fell apart for her when she took a stand against corruption and publicly spoke out against corruption. So she was detained and tortured and fled the country in the early part of 2012. She came to Minnesota in 2013 and then got connected with Advocates for Human Rights.
The asylum process of seeking protection for refugees that are fleeing their countries is supposed to take a matter of months. The wait often ends up being longer, and if we have a client that comes in our door today, we're telling them it's about 3 to 5 years before they'll even have an interview on their case.
Christine is actually one of the luckier ones. She had her interview in the summer of 2014, was granted asylum on account of political opinion in July of 2015. So we immediately started the family reunification process.
We spend a lot of our time in our work talking with clients about the darkest moments in their lives, the most difficult things, and making the case to the U.S. government that this person has been harmed and needs protection. But moments like these, you see the resilience come true, and that all of our clients are survivors, and they all have so much strength. And to see a family reunited like this and see them strong again, being able to be here and witness sort of the beauty of that is really one of the joys of the work that we do, and what gives us momentum to continue forward and continue to help it.
When our partners identify barriers to safety and security, we dig in to understand the gaps in legal protections and develop solutions.
The ability of the COVID-19 research team at the Advocates for Human Rights to quickly organize, conduct, and summarize interview data with advocates and systems actors was instrumental in giving the coalition a robust picture of victim needs and criminal legal system response during the early stages.
By engaging volunteers in hands-on human rights work, the Advocates not only accomplishes critical research and advocacy, we transform volunteers into advocates for human rights. Last year, more than 1,300 volunteers joined us in defending human rights, from monitoring deportation hearings at the immigration court to representing clients in their asylum cases. From fighting to end the death penalty around the world to building a bright future for children. We all have a part to play in defending human rights. Join us.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's discussion with recent volunteer award winners, Joan Kuriansky, Judy Karate, and Sarah Musgrave, and one of our newest board members, Bindi Swami.
It's fun to be with you. I always enjoy my connection to Advocates for Human Rights. And it is true, I began my work in the 1990s, initially doing actually training on issues related to domestic violence for 5 countries in Eastern Europe. The training itself took place in Ukraine, but we worked with a number of countries. Subsequently, I was asked to do fact-finding, particularly in Armenia. And later became one of the first in the delegations to Geneva.
That's impressive shoes to follow, Joan. I am the newest board member, as Teresa pointed out, and a current volunteer pro bono attorney with the Refugee and Asylum Program. I have both affirmative and defensive cases assigned to me. So I've volunteered the gamut offered in that program. My volunteer experience with the organization, though, began back in J term as a sophomore in college, late in the late 90s, and it left such an impact on me that I just came back. Look forward to growing and learning more with this organization.
I've done everything from working at the front desk, greeting visitors, to editing some of the reports that we write for the United Nations, sitting in on conventions where people will come to our table and ask about the organization. But the most rewarding two activities that I've done is get involved with the International Justice Group in working with United Nations that Joan referenced.
I've done a multiple of things. I've volunteered regularly at the state fair when there's a state fair. I've helped with mailings, the front desk, greeting, and trying to make people feel comfortable there. I maintain the UN deadline database and just special projects people might need when there was an office to go to. So however I can help out, I try to do it.
Why do you volunteer to protect human rights?
Well, I am an immigrant in the United States, and for me, it is volunteering with the advocates specifically is a meaningful way that I can reconnect and give back to an immigrant community. I've benefited tremendously in the United States, and I really would like to pay it forward and to give and see others benefit in much the same way that I have. And another way that I believe I benefit is particularly with the work that I do in the Refugee and Asylum Program. I hear stories of abuse, of human rights abuse, right, that happens all over the world. And it just makes me, I believe, hyper aware of our own country and our own liberties. And if left unchecked, we know from these people's experience what can happen.
I feel like I waited my whole life up to the point of retirement to be able to do this, because when you're working, and I wasn't in a human rights field, I was in financial services, so it's just go, 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 and you're raising a family, and you feel like something is missing. And so getting into this was literally one of the first things I did the first month I retired, and I intended to stick my toe in it and see what else was out there. And I found that with the advocates, there is so much to do, and it touches every hot button for me.
So many people who don't know where to go to, and they will contact the advocates even though what they're asking for is not something, but it's just rewarding just to be able to hear the people out, give them a satisfaction that someone's being heard. And it's a nicer place. It's nice to go to some place that you're going to be heard and helped in some way.
I think from a more selfish point of view, Advocates for Human Rights offers a place where you can feel like you make a difference and you're doing really substantive work. So many, quote, volunteer opportunities don't give you the access to use your skills and to feel like you are really making a contribution.
Just to show you the breadth of what you can experience is in going to the UN to advocate on a specific human rights issue. So many of our clients have experienced some really awful human rights abuses in their native countries, whether it's African countries, Central America, places in Asia. And with their consent, I've interviewed some of them to hear their story, which we protect their privacy entirely, but with their permission. And of course, they said, you can tell this story at the UN. I want my story to be heard. I want there to be a change in my country.
Judy, it sounds like you had a really interesting volunteer opportunity this summer. Could you tell us a little bit more about the bike project?
The advocates approached me late May and said, because of COVID, we have begun the process of sourcing, tuning up, and delivering bikes to our asylum clients. These are people who often are living in the inner city in an apartment, don't own a vehicle in many cases, are using public transportation to get to work and even to get to the grocery store. And many of them lived in, or still live in parts of the city that were, many of them experienced a great deal of arson during the uprising in June after the murder of George Floyd. So their local grocery store was no longer there, the one they used to walk to. So the whole process, the logistics of something like this made me feel a little bit like I was in my old job because it was all about coordinating, picking up bikes, finding the donors, picking up the bike, making sure it worked, making sure it fit the use and the size of the client that who had, you know, raised their hand and said, I'd like a bike when we did the initial survey. So in the course of about 2 months, we were able to source and deliver, I think, 37 bikes to 33 families. There were a lot of kids involved who were getting their first bike. I cannot tell you. One of them that I delivered happened to be on her fourth birthday. So everybody was crying. She was so excited. But it really felt like, in this time when we're stuck at home, you know, everybody wore masks, everybody kept their distance away from each other, but that something really special happened, and I was the luckiest recipient of what I got from working on that project.
And Sarah, are you continuing your work on the deadline database and continuing your work to help respond to people's inquiries at the Advocates for Human Rights?
Oh, definitely. That's like about the only thing I'm really doing. So yeah, I make sure I do that. Yeah, and I feel like I'm helping because I get calls where they say I'm the first person who's called them back. And so it's frustrating that you can't really help them, but then they also appreciate that someone is actually listening to them. So it's sort of my small part that I'm playing.
One thing that was real interesting that we just did last week is we went to the United Nations in Geneva virtually. We had good attendance, and some of the same people that I know very well because I've traveled with them and they're good friends were also on with me, and we rehearsed well, and there were no technical issues. I think the delegates were used to it, and we got some good reviews from them. So I was really happy that we were able to deliver almost the same message with the same passion that we would have done had we been there in person.
Actually, I've done for the advocates was to the Special Rapporteur on domestic violence to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on victims, survivors of domestic violence. And of course, I had to do my research either on Zoom, online, on the phone, but was certainly able to manage to do that and to submit a report that did speak specifically to how COVID was affecting the lives of women and families. And my focus was easier because it was in the District of Columbia, but of course it really could have been in Colombia because it was the same phone, you know, you were making the same phone calls. You weren't having face-to-face meetings. So I too have seen, one, how the advocates can continue to be so relevant to the issues that are occurring now and will continue after COVID. But also personally, it was a way for me to make connections in doing the research with friends, colleagues, strangers who were doing the kind of work that was important to be reported on.
What do you have to say to someone who's thinking about volunteering?
I would say that there are the opportunities for volunteering at the advocates is so vast. It is not just providing legal services, right? It is, if you're a good writer, you could be writing reports or editing or stuffing envelopes, or in the course of my work, I've worked with medical professionals who are providing their services. So it's unlimited, the scope of services that you can provide as a volunteer. I say just if the advocate's mission resonates with you, just do it. That's the advice I can give.
The place is so open that people are friendly. You can bounce ideas off people there. So you might start off with one thing and then find something else which is more of an interest or whatever. So if you just have an interest, just come in. And you don't have to be an expert. There's a lot of things around the office to do, also to help out.
I would say, to coin a phrase, just do it.
Whatever your skills are, there's a place for you. Bring your expertise. Feel comfortable with what you can bring. Your life experience, your specific training, your exposure to different communities, bring that to the table at Advocates, and you will find a place at that table. And you can also find not only new skills, but new relationships, ways of thinking, acting, because of the variety of experiences that are welcome at Advocates for Human Rights.
Thank you, Bindi, Joan, Judy, and Sarah for joining me, and for all that you do as Advocates for Human Rights. We work with volunteers in our home community and around the world. If you're interested in learning more about how to get involved, please visit our website at www.theadvocatesforhumanrights.org/volunteer.